interesting.
And after that, it gets more of a video game vibe.
Out of curiosity, how much of that comes from like the video game
Oh,
angle?
we lost you there for a sec, Phil.
Oh, how much of that comes from the video game angle? I'm wondering.
The what game?
Sorry, what?
Okay, let me try this again. Am I cutting out?
Not now.
You're cutting out a little bit, but you've.
Oh, okay. How much of this comes from the video game angle? Because one of the things I remember very clearly as a kid playing Dragon Quest for the first time. Well, in America it was Dragon Warrior, but playing that game for the first time, I always felt like I was the main character, sort of, and like I was sucked into the world, and I had to kill the Dragon Lord or whatever, and I was fighting the slimes, and there was this very kind of like self-insert way about it, where it's not like I'm playing the main character, I am the main character. And I'm wondering how much that has had an impact, because like you get a lot of the video gaminess coming out of a lot of these isekai, especially some of the more recent ones that have been adapted have pretty video gamey, and even just non-isekai fantasies have some video gaming aspects to them. Character sheets written on your back, for example, and stuff like that. So it's like, how much of that is goes back to Dragon Quest, and was Dragon Quest in a sense because of that self-insert. I don't know if it was designed to be that way in Japan, but it certainly felt that way over here. And so it's kind of like imagine you're in an isekai situation kind of deal. I'm wondering how much impact that's had.
Most of the authors I've spoken to have referenced at least one kind of like medieval fantasy RPG. Oftentimes it's Chrono Trigger. I think I've had one Dragon Quest. A lot of it is Final Fantasy, especially some like the older ones. So games are very important. A lot of these people, a lot of these authors do draw upon their experiences playing specific games, and sort of like translating that into their stories. And you can actually kind of see this actually in a particular kind of I think it's easy to think of like isekai as like a bunch of different lineages, right? And so you can actually kind of see this in a particular isekai lineage that's kind of like under discussed, and yet nevertheless is like hugely important, because not only did it it's kind of been around before even sort of online, but like a lot of people just don't really talk about it, and that is otome game isekais. Where you've got like the girl, and then she's got to like romance guys, and then she's got to like figure out what's going on, and then sometimes there's like a murder mystery or something.
Just to add to that point, like I have been noticing a few more of those type of stories coming out. Like
they're
I've been
coming
noticing like
out.
a lot more fucking Yuri and Yaoi and shit coming out as far as like light novels are concerned. Like I have noticed more of that stuff coming out. So just to add to your point.
They've always been there, but like they're just blowing up, or like they're kind of just blowing up now, which is kind of really funny.
Are they getting any adaptations?
Sexiled got licensed in English like I think a month ago, and I think that's got a few volumes. There's the I think it's the villain, like my life reborn as a villainess.
Yeah, Bakarina. Yep.
Yeah, that one. I can't think of anything else, but like off the top of my head, but those are like the first two. What else would be like that? Sort of Sojo. There is the other one where it's like, it's not my fault, my husband's a beast or something like that, or my husband's head's a beast or something.
Right.
Like there's a couple I can think of. Like I don't have the list with me right now, but just to add to your point, like there's definitely like an influx of this shoujo like stuff.
Well, Joe's talking more about historical though, aren't you, rather than current stuff.
Well, it's really current now. It's like
well, it's become current now. Yeah. But
I think if we're
like,
talking about
when we're talking about lineage, we're obviously talking a bit more about.
I know, but like Joe was just he was just talking about it, and I just thought I would like add to it because I
Okay.
felt it was relevant to the topic.
We'll let
Yeah.
Joe continue then.
Wait, what was the question? What were we talking about before?
The how Otome games
Damn it, Bio.
are one lineage.
Sorry,
Fuck you, fool.
I'm stone cold sober, right? So I'm having a lot of difficulty thinking.
We
Uh,
gotta
drink.
put some fuel in the furnace.
I'm gonna go get
No
I'm gonna go get a
alcohol in my
bottle of
body
fuel.
right
I'll
now.
be back in a little bit. Keep going.
Now, well, you were talking about the Otome.
We're talking about Otome games, and I was like bringing some light novels because I was talking about like how
which
like the
was kind
influx
of-
of
which was kind of.
Oh no, before that.
How there is a under talked about lineage of Isekai, which is the Otome.
Oh no, before that.
But before that was that
That's where
the
I
game,
got lost.
the game the game.
Oh,
video
how
games.
important the game
Yeah,
is.
How
Okay.
important the video games are, and then you
Okay.
you were mentioning how the games that some of the people you've interviewed or the authors you've interviewed were what they were talking about, which was mainly Final Fantasy and that kind of thing, and then you transitioned into talking about the kind of lineage that isn't really talked about a lot, which was the Otome type stuff.
yeah, which
Okay.
is where I jumped in because with the light novels.
Which
and
is where
shit.
you jumped in and ruined everything, but no, I'm joking.
I didn't fucking ruin everything. Blame Joe for not being drunk.
Alright, anyway.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's easiest to probably think of isekai as not like one thing that like has like a very clear distinct lineage. Like, like this led to this and then this led to this and then this led to this. And even that like we can kind of just sort of actually we can kind of dismantle isekai in regards to like based upon their socioeconomic contexts. And what I mean by that is that like we can dismantle we can say like we've got isekai, but there are commonalities that exist between, for example, like isekai that are on shosetsu versus like isekai that was published through arguably more quote unquote traditional channels. For example, Choyuyu, one of the shows that's airing this season, it's the one with the 7 overpowered high schoolers. That one is by the author of what's it called? Chivalry of a Failed Knight. And that one never came from shosetsu. And so like that one has like a kind of different sort of like place if we're talking about like socioeconomic and sort of historical trajectory than say something like Noryoku, which is I said to make my abilities average, which did come from shosetsu. And so like we can also see it in something like Gate, right? Like Gate was never on shosetsu. I think it was published online through a blog, but not on shosetsu specifically.
It wasn't shosetsu. Neither was Sword Art Online, Overlord, and Yojo Senki.
Yeah. And so like in this case, right? Like so some of these stories might be facing different like challenges in terms of like their writing. Because they might be dealing with slightly different audiences. An example would be, for instance, if we're talking about like shows that are like going to be like, if we're going to talk about like stories that are going to be turned into shows, and this is really important in the context of like the sheer numbers. These things, it's so like, isekai are an incredibly like, it's an incredibly competitive space right now. Right now in shosetsu, there's about 700,000 of these things. And one of the things that's like really important is that like out of like the 700,000 entries, there's like 30 have been made into anime. Like something around that number. And so like the stats are really stacked against these authors. And so in that context, you can have like a lot of authors who are like incredibly influential who may not actually have like adaptations into anime or just getting adaptations into anime or like may never get adaptations into anime. An example of somebody who's just getting it now, for instance, is the oh my god, what's it called? God, it starts with an M. Just getting adaptation now. Mushoku Tensei.
Yeah, the other one.
Yeah. Like that one in the context of like between authors gets referenced a lot in terms of how influential it is. But we're only getting the adaptation now.
When
In
was it
comparison,
first
for
written?
instance, I think it was 2013.
Alright, yeah.
But essentially, another one, for instance, right, would have been like Remonster. Remonster is sort of like considered to be like one of the earlier, older sort of like dark isekai, which started off as a series of like unfocused cluster stories in 2011, and then it sort of germinated into like a story on its own in 2013. But like it might not ever get an anime adaptation. It's got a game adaptation. It's got light novels. It's got light novels. It's got games. It's got manga. But like I don't know. There's no anime adaptation.
At the moment, yeah.
And there's also something that like gets talked. There's also something that like authors note that doesn't really get talked about here as well, which is that like a lot of some of these publishers, some of the publishers, when we're talking about like, are we going to get into sort of the isekai being like overwrought and people can get tired of it and so on and so forth. We can't ignore how popular the light novel or the web novel side of it is, and the reason why is because these publishers play an important financial and operative fulcrum in terms of how these anime are made. So the example that I would argue is probably makes the most sense would be Earthwalker, I believe they're called Earthwalker or Earth Comic Walker. They are the publisher of Norioku. The I said to make my abilities average, and so one of the things that's really important, right, is that like I asked the author of Norioku. I was just like, okay, you've written a lot of stuff, but like why this specific one? Like why this specific story? Why did they make this one into an anime? And it's because the author essentially says, well, it's probably because that like Norioku was one of Earth Comic Walker wanted to try and get their feet into making anime. They wanted to get into the sort of production process. Um, and Norioku was one of their best-selling works. So in this sense, the sales of the sales of the light novel really mattered in terms of like this is what determined what was getting made. And you can kind of see this, right? I think in terms of like the 2016s, 2016, 2017, early 2017, right after the ReZero, like right after the first ReZero season came out, like that boom, that sort of anime boom was really important because if you look at Shosetsu, what was topping Shosetsu's charts at the time when ReZero came out, and just a little bit time after that, it was Death March, it was Isekai Smartphone, it was like these stuff that like didn't seem to really make sense yet in terms of why they would be so popular, but all that was known is that that was popular. And so like the business model essentially suggests that this is a way to approach it.
Yeah.
So like that's why we did get stuff like Smartphone and Death March, which is like kind of don't make sense initially, but it makes sense if you consider like the whole the whole economic network that exists.
I did notice that that ReZero, it was the one that caused this anime boom, but Log Horizon was really the first success story outside of Sword Art Online. But Log Horizon was the first shousetsu work that made it all the way to an anime. And yes, and yet it didn't cause this boom. Maybe it caused a lot of popularity and a lot of buzz to start writing on shousetsu, but it didn't cause this anime boom.
Interesting.
Because
You're talking about
stuff.
the anime?
yeah, the Local Horizon came out before ReZero, and
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea if Local Horizon prompted more people to use Shosetsu over others. But yeah, I just found it interesting that it was ReZero and not Local Horizon. That well, money of course. If
I
local,
th- I I think yeah, I don't know as well, to be entirely honest, right? But I think it just might be that like ReZero just felt different enough, right? You know?
Mm.
Like it doesn't matter if you like loved it or hate it, you know. What matters is that like it felt like different enough that it could be like very sufficiently sold. Um and I think I mean like they had a lot of faith in it. I mean the first episode was an hour long.
oh yeah, forgot about it.
Like so like that was really like it's they had faith in it, and I think honestly, I think I would have to read more about like the context about ReZero, but honestly, it might have just been like that might have been like a huge concerted push, you know.
Yeah,
Might have just been like this is where they decide to put their eggs in the where like they decide, you know, okay, let's put our eggs in this basket and let's push this, you know. It's got everything we need for it to sell.
got cute girls, self-referential humor,
Yeah.
dark story, drama, fights, less pushing up the bridge of your glasses.
Yeah. And it's also like it also has that sort of like weird not weird but it also has like that sort of like additional element that I think it has that additional element that I think is sort of like very otaku, um which is that like it does this thing that's really helpful, I think, which is that it's very otaku, but at the same time it's very good at like sort of like trying to tell a story that doesn't necessarily have to sort of fall back to otaku stuff. In that like it's a loser, but he has a power, but he keeps fucking up. And then, you know, what ends up happening is that all of a sudden, boom, there's a political intrigue. And so you're just like, oh, okay, now there's a political intrigue. And then, you know, and then he has to figure out how to navigate through all that kind of stuff. But the thing that, like, I think really made it sold is that, like, it was like the sort of general audience worked fairly well, general audience kind of thing. But it's a very otaku kind of story underneath it, you know. Like I think I've mentioned this before, right? But like, you know, it's very good at signaling to otaku. So for example, right, one of the things that happens immediately in the first episode is Subaru, he gets transported, you know, boom, he gets sent to the other world. But like, where's he get sent from? Well, it's a convenience store. And the convenience store actually has a very specific registry in terms of like otaku stuff, because the convenience store, the konbini in Japan, is sort of considered to be the fortress of the otaku. It's considered to be like the big fortress. And the reason why is because they can get all their stuff done at the konbini, and then they can go back to their homes and then do whatever it is they want to do.
Yeah, you can even pay bills there.
Yep, exactly. And so like, and you know, at the very end of my there's something. In my fourth apocalypse video, at the very end, I mentioned somebody by the name of Kentaro Takekuma. Right, he's an author and he's also a scholar, and he kind of talks about like random otaku stuff. But one of the things he talks about, right, is that like he talks about the. Also, please stop me if I'm rambling too much.
No.
Because
It's still about
fine.
an isekai, so I allow it.
And this is kind of why we wanted you here.
Yeah. And you
so-
have been, and to be fair, you have been silent for like 90% of this until now, so it's good.
So
Keep going.
So Kentaro Takekuma, right, in the Genron circle, which is like it's like a circle that like Azuma Hiroki runs, and then he just talks with like people in media and architecture and all that kind of stuff. But there's this one thing about Kentaro Takakuma that he mentions that like after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, the power goes out in huge parts of Japan, right? The power goes out, and then you have all of these scholars talking about like how eerie it is driving down these highways and streets and the lights are not on. And the reason why is they say is because that they're so used to a Japan, even at night, a Japan where the lights are always on. The whole scenery is illuminated. There's a very specific, like, everything is taken for granted that the power always is going to be there. And then, boom, the disaster happens, the power gets cut out, people start rationing. They start rationing power and all that kind of stuff. But Kentaro Takakuma says that he goes at it a little differently because he's talking about otaku. So he says there's something really awkward, something really weird. It's actually in the video link. So in my fourth Apocalypse video, in the video description, you should see an article called "The Day the Endless Everyday Ended." And what he means by that is he's talking about in the context of the convenience store. He says that this is the first time in a very, very long time, possibly the first time in his life, where the convenience store shut down. The power's out. And the reason why that's important is because the convenience store was always the symbol of like otaku sort of like homology. It was always like the place that they could go to, be safe, do the things they want to do, boom, and then go back to their homes and then do whatever it is they want to do. They can get everything done there. And it's 24 hours. It's always open. So they're used to this. Kentaro Takakuma is used to this. But boom, now the power's out and he feels this unease because what the hell is he going to do now? Well, what happens at the beginning of ReZero? He gets sent from the convenience store. He leaves the convenience store. Boom. Now all of a sudden he's in this new world. And so like immediately, right, by leaving the convenience store in that sense, it's a very clear like signaling to its audience, You can also hear in the context of like how Subaru oftentimes uses like sort of very self-deprecating language. One of the things that he calls himself Yutori, which is like a sort of, it's kind of like how boomers would call like young people millennials, it's a sort of like disparaging kind of term in a way. And so, but he calls himself that. Like he's directly referring to himself in that sense. There's also the context of, there's also the case of the first arc. The first arc is literally like a mystery, and it's a murder mystery too. Somebody dies, but who dies? Well, we got to figure it out. I'm going to use my power to figure it out. And not only is it that, but it's also a mystery that uses time resets. So mysteries and time resets are both very, very strong elements of otaku storytelling, especially since Nishio Isin popularized them in the early 2000s. I mean, like, you can make the argument that, like, even this initial plot of, like, the murder mystery, trying to figure out what the murder mystery is, what's going to happen, how do we figure out who's the killer and all that kind of stuff, that itself is such a hallmark of visual novels and visual novel storytelling. That, like,
I mean, if you read Nishio Ishin's like Zorigato, for example, you can definitely see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, if we're going to talk about like otaku text, right? Go back to Haruhi. Literally, one episode is about like the murder mystery on the island. What's happening?
Also, didn't Haruhi like start some fucking weeb religion or some shit like that?
You talking about Haruhiism?
That's a bit off topic,
Yeah.
but
That's I think that's more like something in the West. I've never heard it mentioned in the context of Japan, but I might just not be like well read enough, right? So
okay, thank you. Just asking.
So in this context, right? I think part of the reason why when you look at like something like Log Horizon versus like ReZero, like why is ReZero a more compelling case as to like why it possibly it led to this sort of like Isekai explosion, or like at least like why is it so like hugely popular? And it's that like it's really good at signaling to multiple audiences at a time, whereas I think Log Horizon is a little bit more focused in terms of who its audience is. Like it literally, it's like they start from Akiba and then they sort of fan out. And so like they start from Akiba, they spread out, and then they start creating this country. And so like in that context, right, like Log Horizon draws a little bit more from something like, for instance, like Eiku no Senso from 2001. Like it leverages a bit more, expecting its audience will know what it's going to be doing. Whereas ReZero is kind of doing a bunch of different things at once, and so it can capture a lot of different audiences at once.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one is better than the other or something.
No,
I'm
no,
just
no.
saying that
No,
might be
no,
why
no.
it's so successful.
No, it's interesting.
I do sneakily wonder if Local Horizon did do something to Shosetsu. If it had an impact. Or it
Yeah,
was
so,
just
like,
an expected consequence of being a popular light novel after being picked up from Shosetsu
Yeah,
itself.
it's I think there's like I think it's a little hard to figure out at this time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a few challenges associated with that, and the first one is that, like, when we're talking to, like, authors and readers and whatnot, like, they don't always have, like, the most, when we're talking about, like, broad history, they don't often have, like, the most accurate memory
Now nobody
of a
has.
lot of stuff.
And because a lot of people don't think to, catalog.
Yeah, like, a lot of them,
this
like,
type of
don't.
thing.
Yeah, a lot of them don't think about it in, like, the sort of, like, Walter Benjamin perspective, in the context that, like, this moment is a moment that is immediately going to be recorded for a history, right? They just think about it as like, oh, this shit's happening now, you know?
Oh yeah, I'm just gonna pump out my light novel. I just want just
Yeah, you know, like,
write,
you
write,
don't.
write it and pump it out.
Yeah, you know, you don't think about the things you're doing today as, like, something that could be, like, mapped out or, like recorded for some, like, future thing to be looked back on, you know?
Yeah, you don't think, oh shit, that story I made about
Yeah.
the guy in the Sword Art on the lines is gonna be the fucking the big explosion thingy, and oh, maybe I should, like, actually catalog my thought process in making this, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
You
or
don't
at least a
think
lot
about
of
it.
people don't.
Yeah, a lot of people don't.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So and so, like, in that sense, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting in that sense, where it's like, how can I describe it? Fuck. So in that sense, it's, like, hard to get an idea of, like, what was happening at that time. Because, like, one, not only do they not have, like, the greatest memory, because, like, remember, this is like 5 to 8 years ago now.
Yeah.
And, like, fuck, dude, I don't remember what I did last week. Right.
I know that.
Don't have your magic juice, man. We need to pump you full of magic
that's
juice.
Yeah, and it's also, like, if we acknowledge or if we believe that isekai can have a lot of different, like, sort of, like, lineages and a lot of different influences, then that means that they're gonna have a lot of different subcultures, and they do. And so, like, one author or a group of authors' perspectives about a very specific, like, thing might be tainted by their own internal subculture. You know, they might think that isekai has this history of this thing, but that's because that their frame of reference is that they exist in, like, circles that, like, value those things, you know?
Yeah, I could. I heard. I think it's accurate, but yeah, that the authors of Local Horizon and Overlord play D&D together or something.
Yep.
It-
I don't know about together, but
Or
they definitely do.
they need. I heard a story that they knew each other. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe they both play D&D. That is true.
Okay.
But that
I
would
don't know
mean
about
that
that.
they're both, of course, MMO transported from a video game and from an MMO. So I would think that the author of Overlord would look at Local Horizon and look, damn, I was here before him. Maybe I should ask my light novel guy what's up with that. And sure enough, after Local Horizon, Overlord got an anime. Maybe is a bigger story. Maybe it's just a coincidence.
I don't know. I have no idea.
No, me neither.
I do know that Maruyama Kugane, like, played a ton of tabletop. Specifically because I asked him on Twitter.
the best place to conduct interviews. Just
Well, that was like when I was like, like still like figuring out like what games like influence people, and I just flat out asked them on Twitter.
yeah.
And then I was just like, like what was your biggest influence in terms of like games or whatnot? And he just flat out said tabletop RPGs.
Yeah, well, there you go. Simple questions, simple answers.
Yeah.
It's always good. All right.
Yeah,
I think,
this is
I
there was a
think-
little bit of the history and the current, what is happening now because of the history, but what is the future?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting.
Probably. So one of the authors. So I'm gonna have to draw from a bunch of different authors because they have a lot of different perspectives on this. One of the authors that I talked to said that that it's possible that isekai might just die out because like the thing is that like senki start to die out. And so like they're just saying like we're just gonna see some new thing, and then that was just gonna move, and it's just like okay. Another one, Kanikiru Kokitsune, the Read Monster author. He said that we're starting to see. So he's speaking specifically from the perspective of what's it called? He's speaking specifically from the perspective of oh my god, shosetsu, and he's saying that we're seeing the rise of dungeon stories. So dungeon K, he calls them, and they're like danmachi, they're like stories that like are medieval fantasy gamey, but they're not isekai.
Yeah.
There's no moving over.
Kind of like the type of things that is about to get an anime adaptation, which is good old Heel Bro. Redo
Yep,
of a Heel-
Oh, boy.
Kaifuku
Yes,
Jutsushi. Yep.
So it's like so that kind of thing is from what you're telling, or from his perspective, right? Is currently the thing that seems to be
Yeah.
rising within that
Yeah.
sphere. So we might end up seeing a lot more of them later down the road getting anime adaptations if we're about to see a sort of, I wouldn't say explosion, but maybe an uptake in those types of stories on shows. My pronunciation of words is terrible.
Shosetsu ga ni naru.
Sosetsu,
Sosetsu?
or whatever.
Sosetsu?
Yeah, the
Shosetsu
autism's
is
really
just fine,
strong
yeah.
with me. So, but you know what I'm talking about though, yeah. So
Yeah.
so from there, so it'd be interesting to see years down the road if that prediction is correct and that we see an uptake of those types of stories and that leads to.
I
Yeah,
mean,
the same
I've
type of
definitely
thing.
noticed, like, as far as like light novels are concerned, like more of those kind of stories are popping up. Like, not exactly to the same extent as like Shield Bro, but like more like, well, the hero went and saved the kingdom, but he was betrayed because of political machinations or whatever. Or
Yeah, now
blah,
he's
blah,
just
blah,
gonna
blah.
fuck off and just do random shit.
Or
Yeah.
or the other one would be revenge stories, because that's another thing.
Yes.
is
Revenge
we've
stories
got-
have been around for a while, yeah.
Well, yeah, but like I'm talking about like what we're going to start seeing as possible uptakes in the types of stories being
Yeah.
produced. So
Yeah, that's a growing tag on Shosetsu as well. The tag is well, it's not really like a full tag in itself, but it's kind of like a soft tag.
like a subcategory.
Yeah, they're called zamma, which essentially just refers to like you got what you deserved. That's essentially what it means.
Right.
It's just slang for just you got what you deserve in short. And so like those are called like zanma stories, where it's just like people get screwed over, but like now he's gonna come back and he's gonna kill everyone. And so you have you have like stuff like the hero brave wants revenge, or a little bit berserk of gluttony, but not really.
Berserk of Gluttony is less about vengeance, but more like a guy trying to like subvert his fate.
Yeah,
If I
he does
because,
get
like, with
revenge on
Bers-
one of his bullies by making him pee in public.
Yeah, but like Berserk of Gluttony isn't like about revenge as such.
Yeah.
It's about a guy who finally has the power to fight back, but that
Right.
power has consequences.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And
I get it, yeah.
and there are isekai that are like that too. Like there's one isekai where it's like Yusha no Nidobe or something. It's like the hero's second life or something. Where
I think I've been reading the manga of that one. It's the one
yeah, it's like where he gets.
it's the one with all the gore in it. Is it that one? Because there's.
Well, a lot of them have gore.
I'll go find the name of it.
Yeah. Well, it's the one where like he gets screwed over in the first cycle, and so like he gets like restarted because he quote unquote beat the tutorial.
Yeah. I think that's the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay.
I've been reading the manga of that.
Which I think is kind of like I'm sure it's like completely unintentional, right? But like I think it's kind of like a funny. I think it's kind of like a funny sort of like inadvertent sort of social commentary. That like a lot of these sort of situations use that sort of like you beat the tutorial, now now you get to do it again. Like kind of argument.
Since I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because I'll just fuck it up. I'll just put it in text in the pop chat. So, hang on, just give me a second.
But I think it is funny that like the tutorial apparently reveals that you're gonna get fucked over.
There you go.
Yeah,
Nidoman.
Nidoman Yusha. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one I've been reading.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go save that for later.
It is very very on the gory side of things. Very. But it's.
Thank you. No.
I can agree with you. Yeah, I think maybe it is a sort of commentary on that type of thing.
I think a lot of them are like there's one like called Dungeon Seeker, which is by an author aptly named Sakamoto 666.
Yeah.
Xbox Live, Destroyer of Worlds, Triple X.
But do you guys want me to spoil what happens at the end of it?
Why not? Fuck it.
Yeah, why not?
Okay, well, so the whole plot of Dungeon Seeker, right, is a bunch of people get sent to this other world, but like before they get sent, God says, "Well, hey there, everybody, I want to play a game."
Would you like to play a game?
Would you like to play a game? And so like God puts them all in like weird like scenarios and really shitty scenarios, and he gets sacrificed into a pit. And then he finds out that like he can like eat things. He can like eat monsters and then gain their powers and all that kind of stuff. And his goal is to get to the bottom of the dungeon because according to somebody that he just met, the bottom of the dungeon is like the gateway to God, and so he wants to kill God. So he eventually wins. He gets to the bottom of the dungeon, kills God, and then his reward is that he goes back to Japan. And that's how it ends. But the last chapter, he goes back to Japan. But he goes back to Japan as like a piece of shit assassin. And then like it just ends with the words, "The world is a dungeon."
Mindfuck.
And so like there are isekai that are like incredibly cynical about like the world in which these authors are living in.
Right.
It's almost like that quote from Berserk in the Lost Children's arc, like, there is no sanctuary or paradise for you to find rest or something like that. I'd have to find like the panel, but
that does sound. Was this the same offer as No, it isn't as Remaster, but I could swear that the ending of that is the beginning of Remaster. No, because
the beginning of Remonster, right? He gets born in Goblin Society and he just eats and kills his way to the top of it.
To become the Alpha Goblin.
Yeah, but in the manga, it's a little bit off topic, but in the manga it's revealed that he was some kind of also had
Oh yeah, you're talking about like Okay, so yeah, in the manga it was like an other Japan's like Esper society.
Oh yeah.
And then he gets killed by a coworker, I believe, right?
Yeah, something like that.
He gets stabbed by a coworker because Espers didn't see it coming. So he gets stabbed by a coworker.
Yeah, and all the people that he's fucking eaten, he didn't have fucking like future sight or any shit like that. Like, I call bullshit.
Yeah, he really lucked out on that. Well, he didn't look on. Yeah. But yeah, but his Esper powers, carry over.
Yeah.
And that's how he gains the ability. Which honestly, I think that would have made more sense. To be like, oh, why does he have this weird power? He's always had it. I was like, all right, fine, okay, yeah, I'll buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not an isekai because it's not from our world to the underworld.
Oh no.
Not an isekai.
That's that like yeah. So like there is this like other thing that I've always like considered, right? Which I've always wondered is that like does it have to be Japan or does it have to be like a world? Does it have to be like a world jump, right? Because like talking to Kanikiru, right? Talking to Kanikiru, he definitely considers Remonster to be an isekai. Like he really does believe it to be an isekai. So in that context, it's just like, and like a lot of the people he's worked with and a lot of his like audience believes it to be an isekai. So it's just like, I think it doesn't have to be like just this world, but that like it's like the world jump, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
that was kind of what we were going on about before, and how I was describing like there has to be like almost an A to B kind of jump. Like it maybe doesn't have to be like
Yeah,
our
I don't
world.
think it has to be like
world,
this
like
there.
like our world to another world. It could be like it has to be the home world that the person is from to a different world, not necessarily like always be Earth. Like it could be another whatever. Because in Remonster, if I remember correctly, it's like he starts off in sort of like an almost sci-fi fantasy, like sort of sci-fi type, futuristic,
sci-fi Japan.
Yeah, sci-fi futuristic-y type Japan type world. Which was it actually confirmed to be like Japan, or was it just a like just generalized sci-fi setting type thing?
It's like an alternate Japan.
Alternate Japan, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I would consider that to be isekai.
I do think it would need to be recognizable by the reader.
Yeah.
It should be a something that we as readers could consider as a home. I don't think a setting where a fantasy world character gets transferred to another fantasy world. I don't think it would get the same feeling. That
there are some of them that exist like that. Like for instance, like the former Brave candidate who now lives in another world is one where like he lives in a fantasy world and then he gets summoned to another fantasy world. But in this other fantasy world, there's no slavery.
So he
but the irony. Well, the irony is that so he's in this fantasy. So he's in like fantasy world A, which has slavery. He's not into slavery, but he goes into fantasy world B, which doesn't have slavery. But a lot of his magic is about enslaving things.
Oh,
so it's just like how ironic.
Does he have to invent slavery now?
Huh?
Does he have to invent slavery?
No, he doesn't. He still rejects. So he rejects slavery, but he kind of does things inadvertently that kind of just are kind of like war conquering slavery. Like he finds a wife.
He's doing crimes.
Well, it's kind of weird, right?
Is he like the Roman Empire? Is he like the Roman emperors? You know, they came, they saw, they conquered.
Well, so he has a lot of magic that's just like, do you want to enslave this? And he's like, no, I'm not going to. I refuse to enslave people. But then he gets a wife, upon who decides to marry him because he essentially beat her in a contest of strength. And then he gets a bunch of he develops a harem, but like every member of the harem is somebody that he's like physically defeated.
Oh, so it's
it's just like
in a sense, he's not using his powers to enslave, but he's
but it's just like this,
people.
But like it feels like the story's winking at me, you know?
Right? Yeah, I get what you're saying. Right? Like it's like by technicality, it's almost like how in Slime,
what?
he's not technically
he's like
people,
he's not technically enslaving them, but he did literally just name all of them. All right, and now they just
he gave
swear
them a name,
fealty to his might.
He gave them a name, and that like creates a magical contract. That
it's not the name they chose.
Yeah, that's. It feels very similar to that, where it's like, yeah, it's not slavery, but it's
Yeah.
kind of slavery.
Which is like, it's funny because like that was one of the things that like kind of bothered me when like slime was. So when the Shield Hero thing was like happening on like Twitter,
Yeah.
right? That was one of the things
Yeah.
that bothered me, right? Which is like a lot of people are just like, don't bother with Shield Hero. Shield Hero sucks. It's got slavery, etc., etc., etc. You know, you should watch Slime. That's the
but
good
slime
one.
Slime is the good. Yeah, I remember that.
And
It's
I'm
like, yeah, Slime is so good. He's like helping all these people and all this shit. It's like, do you fuckers not understand?
And I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like Slime is more insidious because
A
it
little bit,
feels like
yeah.
it's hiding it.
Especially because
You know?
it's voluntary. Like, a lot of these people do it voluntary. Like, yes, we'll become your
Yeah,
loyal
it's
slave.
like
Yes, master.
indented. What is it? Indented servitude or whatever. Like it's
And
really
then
good.
they
Indentured
all have to
servitude.
conform to Rimuru amazing culture,
Ideals, yeah,
cultures
Yeah.
and
culture and
standards.
ideals.
Yeah, he develops their
like,
culture. He
like-
names them all. Like,
it's so weird because the Shield Hero example of this, you know, with the raccoon girl, right? It's
Mhm.
she is in a significantly better position now than she would have been if he hadn't have like done that, right? So I don't like. Sure, he did the bad thing, which was like buying the slave, because that's what these people view as the sin, right? The sin is that he brought a slave to them, and then that's it. There's no like grey there. There's no, oh well, you know, there's no wiggle room. He committed a sin, but in the committance of that sin, he's actually caused a greater well-being of life for this person. So it's like,
There's
I
so
think-
much.
I think that line of argument is a little. I think that reasoning, right? I get where you're going with it.
Yeah.
I think that reasoning is a little. It makes me a little uneasy because it gets like a little close to like how like some slave owners would legitimize
yeah,
slavery.
and that's.
I get where you're
true,
going
but
with
I'm
it, and I know
yeah,
that that's
yeah,
not what
it's
you're
a
trying to
slippery
say,
slope,
right?
people.
But like,
It's a slippery slope.
Well, I'm thinking about like what was actually portrayed in the show, right? Like that's actually what happened. Was that
I think it's
yeah.
I think the easiest way. I mean, like honestly, I think at least you can give like Shield Hero big ups for actually just showing it instead of pretending like it doesn't
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I'm getting at, right? Is that
Also, it's so weird that like so many people were just like, yeah, no, Shield Hero, that's bad. Isekai bad, but like nobody said that when like Death March happened.
Well, let's can we all like? I think it's also important to like just
cutting out,
mention the fact that I'm not what.
You were cutting out.
Oh, am I cutting out now?
Not anymore.
Try again. See if you.
Okay. I one of the things I just want to point out though about the whole thing with Shield Hero and everything like that is like Japan didn't have the American experience of slavery, right? And so like everybody losing their minds about this is because they're having like the post 1492 mental breakdown, from post 1492 slavery. Like the Romans had slavery, the Mesopotamians had slavery. Turks had slavery. Arabs had slavery.
Almost every single civilization.
Everywhere had fucking slavery.
Everywhere had slavery, and I mean, Vikings had slavery. Believe it or not, medieval Europe kind of didn't, only because it had serfdom. But
which
like,
was technically again. Technically,
yeah, kind of. I mean,
right?
Yeah, kind of.
I think
yeah,
one of the
sorta.
things I think maybe I'll need you to confirm or deny this full, but one of the things that I read that was interesting a while back was that like serfdom was like a little bit more fucked than slavery because it was like an internalized kind of like way of like how somebody was indentured into a system, like.
Well, yeah, it varies from country to country
Okay.
and place to place, but by and large, serfdom is a product of Diocletian's reforms at the in the late Roman Empire. Basically, he came along and said, yeah, whatever job your parents had, you have, going forever. And it was an attempt to try to like repair the damage to the Roman economy and everything like that had happened in the 3rd century. But long story short. that turns into like this sort of kind of villa system where you have tenant farmers working for wealthy villa owners in the countryside in the late Western Roman Empire, and then the barbarians invade, and the Germanic peoples set up their kingdoms, and they adopt the infrastructure of the system. And what happens is basically the tenant farmers become tied to the land, so they can't leave, but they can be thrown off the land. So like they have to pay rent, and that's where we get the word in English landlord from. So they have to pay rent to the landlord for being able to farm the landlord's land, and the landlord could be anything but from a low-ranking knight or baronet all the way up to the king himself. And you could be working as a peasant on the crown lands. Who knows? But you're working, and you're stuck. Like that is your position. Like you're and your family's position all the way down. I mean, whether you're more fucked than you would be in slavery is up for grabs. I mean.
Yeah, like the way I read it, right?
There's some
slavery,
there's
different
really like fucking
situations.
horror stories that I've read and heard about. Like, Jesus.
Oh, depending on who your lord is, it could
I
totally
think
suck.
the boil down is it was kind of fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just-
like what I.
Yeah, I mean,
I just want to go back
What-
slightly to Shield Hero.
yeah, let's get off history.
Let's get
and
off the topic
go
of
back to
slavery.
Isekai.
We'll have to do the
Well-
we'll have to do the critical critique history podcast another time.
Yay!
Yeah.
But going back to Shield Hero and slavery, what I do, when I heard this criticism, oh, it's slavery and it's for slavery. When you see the scenes and the circumstances when he goes to buy a slave, he visits the slave market 3 times, and he visits the slave market only when he has no other options. He tries something, it doesn't fail. He does something, it doesn't work. Then he goes to the slave owner, and the next time, after that, he only goes to the slave owner as a last option.
I think a lot of these people don't understand
I'm
that
not done
like
yet.
Oh, yeah, let Ellie finish.
And whenever he is at the slave market, it's dimly lit, harsh shadows across the face. Eyes of the slave owner are never visible. Our shield hero always looked pained and annoyed to be there. I can't really find any scenario where you could say it's portrayed in a positive light.
Yeah, it's not like he fucking goes there to buy a Raftalia and he's like, ha ha ha, I'm gonna get a fucking slave girl, yeah boy, gonna
Like
get
in
myself a slave.
Yeah, hell
like
yeah,
in
boys.
Slime,
Fuck
it's
yeah.
in Slime gives his names in broad daylight as a fun ritual. It's,
It's not shown as being a like dark and
Yeah,
seedy type thing. When Shield Hero goes to buy Raftalia, it's at night. It's like it's dark. It's seedy. Like it's very well portrayed to the viewer that it's not right. Like it's not trying to tell you like sugarcoat it, right? It's like he's buying a fucking slave, right? And it's not something and that's why I found that criticism so fucking confusing to me. And that's why I think that it's just the fact that he got the slave, and that's a sin, and that's not something that you can't have that.
Well,
apparently,
the people who make these arguments are more like moral puritans. It's basically like, oh, you make one mistake and you are damnation and blah 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 blah. But like the problem is that like especially like in the anime, like you're not in Nafumi's head as much. Like even in the light novel, he's like, I have to do this. I don't have a choice.
yeah,
it's this or die.
I've heard that in the light novel, and I think the manga, but I think more so in the light novel, you get more of his like internal monologue about the things that are
Like
happening.
he does not like slavery. He doesn't
Yeah,
like
and
the idea, but
he
for him
talks
it's a
about-
necessary evil.
Yeah, he talks about that kind of thing where he's disgusted by the fact that he has to actually do this, but it's really the only thing that he's got left to be able to because he needs someone to fight with him. He's the shield hero. He doesn't have offensive
Yeah, he's
capabilities.
fucked, man. He's
he
literally.
he needs to have a sword to fight with him, and everyone thinks he's a rapist, so no one wants to fight with him. The only option he has left is to buy a slave, which is what he does, because what else is he going to do? Like,
And I would ask these people, like, if you were in Nafumi's situation, wouldn't you have done the same? Like, can you really fault him for doing it?
So I think that the argument of the shield hero bad, slime good, right? It was very weird, and I think a lot of it is people just wanting to do outrage farming, and it's fucking because it's all the same people making the same complaints, and I think they do it because it gets them clout. Honestly, I think there's clout to be had in taking shows like that, and the Goblin Slayer debacle, which I think was very similar to the Shield Hero debacle, where it was just a bunch of people making a big hubbub about something that didn't need to have a big hubbub about it. There are criticisms to be had about the implementation and whether or not it did it in a way that made sense or was good or whatever, but that wasn't the criticism, and that's what annoys me. Because when I think about these types of problematic elements in media and that kind of thing, I'd rather look at it from the perspective of, okay, so does this actually need to be here? Does it make sense in the context of the story? Was the implementation
And
good?
I would say yes.
Yes, and that's what I think needs to be talked about, rather than just, oh, slavery's bad. Okay, you can't have the slavery.
Well, why is it bad?
You can't use the trope in the story because it's bad. You have to not
Also,
allowed.
I don't understand this notion of just because a series has it means it endorses it.
Yeah.
Like, for fuck's sakes, Gundam
I
has
just
war and war
showed...
crimes does not mean it endorses said war crimes or war.
No, I just gave the example of in Shield Hero how that is portrayed in many ways, how it's not a positive thing. While in Slime, it's in broad daylight and sunny and all that stuff, which portrays it as indifferent or positive. And
It also kind
Yes,
of
come, be my
odd.
servant, my lovely children. Also, shouldn't we end this soon?
Well,
Because my
no. We'll let
recordings are
Joe. Joe was about to make a point before you cut him off, so let Joe speak.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say, like, it kind of like really it's kind of funny because like a lot of that discussion kind of didn't touch upon like something else, which is that like there is a metaphor that's happening in Shield Hero, and there's a very personal metaphor that was happening, and a lot of people just kind of didn't talk about it really, primarily because like the sort of Twitter outrage machine was so strong. And that was the idea that like Aniko was using that sort of setup as a sort of lamentation of like where online gaming in Japan was at the time. I mentioned this in my third video, and this is directly from her blog, so I'm not just making this shit up.
And for
but
reference,
like
this is then of course in 2011 when it was written.
Yeah, this was from her blog.
Yeah, so nothing to do with the movement known as #MeToo.
No,
and
whatever.
et cetera,
Yeah, whatever. That's good now, though.
Oh yeah. Let him finish. Let him talk.
So one of the things she said was that like she said that like the Shield Hero is sort of like emblematic of like gaming, especially games like Ragnarok Online, when it got into like 2010s, like when like the golden age of net games was starting to die out for them. And so like the idea of Naofumi not having like somebody to like, being a shield and then just like needing to get a slave is a sort of like very awkward, uneasy situation that comes about as like the death of the specialized party member.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. He's the healer that doesn't have a tank.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so like she flat out said that she wrote this story like this because this was a problem that she had, because she's a huge gamer. Like 90% of her blog posts are about just playing Terraria and random shit.
Good game.
But like that was one of the things that she mentioned. She mentioned how like the Spear Hero was like the emblematic of like the early 2000s like net game where like everything all worked out. It was all perfect, and everybody was like, sufficient, all that kind of stuff. But then like
everyone can find a group, have fun, chill out, do the dungeons.
Yep.
Well, this sort of thing happened in the West too. I mean, like I got a number of friends who used to play World of Warcraft, and they have all these memories of these their guilds and the raids and all the things they did. They made friends and like had contact, like meaningful contact and great times with these people. And then like things started to change. Looking for raids started in World of Warcraft, and just like it became more of a solo thing rather than like, okay, I'm signing on. I'm going to meet new people. New people are going to join the guild. There's going to be this sense of community, and I feel like this is, it's weird that this is like a universal type experience. It seems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when they were writing Shield Hero, it's, as you mentioned, it's a very personal kind of, thing about this idea of, well, you can't, things have changed. You can't, these types of games that we used to enjoy together as a group, we can't find people to group with anymore. So, what are you going to do? And I think that's actually, see, that is really fucking interesting. But like you said, no one was talking about that. No one brought that up at all. And
Well, I brought it up in
Because
my
a lot
third
of these people
video.
probably never experienced that. I'm sorry, Jeff.
Oh, sorry.
Go
What were you
ahead.
gonna say?
Well, I probably would say because a lot of the people who are doing the bitching never experienced that. Like especially in the West, like most of this bitching, if I'm correct, was in the West, right?
Yes.
So these people, if they played WoW, they started, they're the reason it's called looking for retard. They jumped in, at that point, and they bitched and complained, because the game was too hard, and they, and that's when, like, all these guys who started playing WoW that I know of that started back in like when it first came out, they all talk about this crop that started showing up, oh god, I forget what the expansion was called. It's the one with the dragon and
Cataclysm?
burning flames or whatever the hell. That's it. Yeah, there you go. And it's like right around Cataclysm, I think, when and they said like just like gradually everything started to shift, and that's when everything started to break down. That's when Looking for Raid, right around when Looking for Raid came out, it seemed. And so like these people who are writing these articles, who are bitching about Shield Hero, they've never played these games. Probably. I mean, let's be honest. Look at them. They're freelance. Most of these idiots
I
were
don't
freelance
want to
journalists.
assume too much about people we don't know that much, only from faceless Twitter accounts.
Yeah, that's true.
that's true, but I
You're a very gentle soul, Ellie. You're a very
but
gentle soul.
I can kind of agree
You're
with
too
Phil, though.
gentle.
I think it's a fact that people, one, they wouldn't have that background context that Joe has, right, of reading the interviews and that kind of thing. But also the fact that they probably, again, haven't experienced it, nor do they really pick up on it. They just see the thing that they don't like, which is the slavery. They view it as the sin, and they committed the sin, and therefore that's it. There's nothing else to it. There can't be anything else to it.
Yeah, I do want to touch on
Well,
one further thing, and that is how even the similar, how some isekai can draw on similar things, but with different stories. If Shield Hero draws on the experience of the disappearance of the specialist role in MMOs, then Overlord is when you are the last one in an MMO at all.
Yeah, so like that's I was gonna mention that. It's kind of funny, right? That both Shield Hero and Overlord are both like fundamentally lamentations of like a game experience,
Yeah.
right? Like Maruyama, like Overlord is like partly this mapping of like Maruyama like somewhat losing friends, as they've like moved on from like the tabletop sessions, and then that's literally what happens with the main character losing this game, and then you have the same relationship with Shield Hero.
It's very interesting.
And it's not your standard issue. It doesn't seem to be your standard issue Mono no Oware kind of experience where the impermanence of these things is kind of just like ruminated upon, or
Cutting out and dropping out again a little bit.
damn it. Nah, never mind. Forget it.
Well, we have just hit 2.5 hours, so
We could talk about
I
so
think
much.
we've reached a peak.
We could have talked so much more about how each isekai and what it draws upon and what it's.
Because let's be real here. There's a lot to talk about. Like, there's a lot of different aspects
Yeah,
to talk
this
about.
requires like multiple videos. Like we'd have to go back and do like a part 2 and a part 3 and a part 4.
Do part
like
2.
fuck.
The Great Isekai Cast Part 2. But no, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground.
We should do that, man. We should do that.
We've covered quite a lot of ground, and we've sidetracked and uptracked and downtracked quite a bit. But I think that at the end of the day, right, it's a genre that we're all somewhat passionate about, and we've kind of come together to sort of try and clarify a lot of different aspects of that a lot of people seem to be just getting wrong.
In
right?
a long
Like,
meandering video.
yeah, which no one's probably going to watch, but what the fuck ever.
I mean, we do have Joe here to share the video around. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, well.
I don't know. One of my friends is
I
probably
don't
going to
have
listen to
any
it. So
social media aside from Discord.
Joe's not got that.
Perfect.
Joe does not have that clout, as the kids
And
say these days.
Based upon my channel numbers, my community doesn't even watch my videos, so
Oh,
Oh, what?
Which is sad, because, not
What?
gonna lie, your videos are really good and should be the fucking gold standard for what people should be striving for,
wow,
in
the
my
minute.
honest opinion.
Let's do a.
well, I clock in at like 5K. I clock in like 5K on like a 30K sub, which is like, I understand why it happens because like YouTube doesn't like sharing it around because it takes so long
Yeah,
for
it
like
takes-
videos to come
yeah,
out.
It's because you're not playing the game, that's why.
Yeah.
Which is
Well, it's because you refuse to play the game.
well, which is no, but that's more of a YouTube problem than a you problem, I think. Honestly,
Yeah. So
because
yeah.
the quality's there. It's just that because you don't do those 10-minute short ass casual videos, it kind of.
also, not gonna lie,
Yeah, like
because
it's almost like people have to like search you out themselves. Like they have to find you.
Yeah.
It's like the search of the Holy Grail,
Alright.
and then they find it, and it just says pause and select, and they found it. They found the Holy Grail.
All right. Well, I'll let Joe finish the point he was just about to make.
oh no, never mind.
You've lost it again.
Um,
Damn it,
I
Mike,
guess-
you keep doing it.
I was hoping to like mention this, but I guess I'll just mention it right now. I think it's important that like regardless of whether somebody likes or dislikes isekai or whatever like personal preferences they have or don't have about this particular set of works, it does not mean that it is not worthy of actually being studied as a thing.
Agreed.
I come across this a lot, where people are just like, "Who cares?" You know. And I feel like, you know, if we shouldn't be okay with bad research simply because we don't like something, you know, like
I would agree because it's that inquisitive mind that took our species to where we were
Well,
today.
here's the thing:
I mean,
if someone says, you know, who cares, you just say, I care. Shut the fuck up. Right? That's
it's
my
the people that
answer
care.
to that. Is like because
Like,
because
listen,
it does
it's the-
matter. Because it does matter. Because having like looking into these things a little bit deeper and getting this kind of knowledge raises the knowledge bar for everyone. Right? It helps everyone be a little bit more knowledgeable about these topics, which is why it's so annoying when you have these people that have these platforms like Gigak and Manime Matt and, you know, whoever else, right? Just not, like, just choosing not, right? Like, just essentially choosing not to,
Yeah,
when they
and-
could,
and-
right? Because I've said it before when
well,
we're
like
talking
Gigok
about...
lives in Japan now.
Yeah, like, I've said it before when, like
he
talking
can,
about...
he has access.
Yeah, like, I've said it before when talking about Manime Matt specifically, like, we're not asking you to do, like, academic level studies. We're just asking you to just go on Google and, like, look, if you make a statement about something, Google the statement just to see if it's true, like, as a bare minimum, right?
Look
Like-
look at my fancy graph of when Isekai was on Shousetsu and when it got an anime. That could clear so much things up for him.
Well, like, so
One-
like
one- once you add the year of 2018 to it.
Yeah, that is perfect.
so I'm gonna use I think I've mentioned this before to somebody else, but I'm gonna use the example of like why knowing these distinctions are important, right? There is a there is, in short, a knowing like some of the context and like some of the history and like some of the challenges associated with writing like something like isekai can be useful even if you don't particularly like isekai, because it can kind of give you a little bit more information as to like why certain things are done certain ways. Because it's not like every author who writes like a shitty isekai is like by default just a shitty writer or an idiot or something.
I mean, you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere.
Well, it's just like it's, how can I describe it? One of the ways in which we can think about this is specifically through like something like Shousetsuka Ninaro, right? Let's become a novelist. The platform, you guys know how it works, right?
Yeah,
Like
ratings.
in terms of how it ranks and all that.
I've got a vague idea.
Ratings, reviews,
Okay.
reading
Yeah,
each other's
and
work.
You've talked to us
Yeah.
before, but for people listening, why not?
Okay,
You know.
so Shousetsuka Ninaro is a amateur writing platform. Sometimes it has professionals. Most of them are amateurs. But there are essentially people who can just post stuff, and they can just post chapters through whatever frequency they want. It like YouTube actually favors frequent uploads at regular intervals, but doesn't have to be. And these stories can run for years because, you know, authors can like go away and then they come back and then they want to continue. They want to, you know, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of ways in which you can edit, take down, re-upload stories and whatnot, so they can constantly be like be working, changing their stories. But they also can have blogs, and they can respond to like comments and whatnot through their blogs. The really important thing about Shousetsu, though, is every single chapter can be rated and comments left. And as a result, Shousetsu ranks a lot of these based upon how much input these chapters get. The more input, the more input plus the higher the rating, the more likely these chapters are going to start clocking up into the ranks. And the more they're going up into these ranks, the more eyeballs they're going to get. And the holy grail is that and then Shousetsu essentially is a site where it ranks the top 10 out of all of its categories. It ranks the top 10 out of all of its categories at a time. So you get to see what the top 10s in each category are. This is important because you can categorize your story as falling under, like, I don't know, like this world, you know, or isekai, or fantasy, low fantasy, high fantasy, otome game, you know, like all of these different categories. And if you get to the top of it, then, you know, you're going to get a lot of eyeballs. You're going to get light novel. You're probably going to get light novel publishing deals, all these kinds of things. You're going to get a ton of benefits because Shousetsu works with a lot of these publishers. And a lot of these publishers are looking at these stories for new things to take and adapt and so on and so forth. And so in this context, the system of the platform plays an incredibly important role in informing how you write your story. Because you can come into this, right? Like, I have a story on Shousetsu, and it does absolutely terribly. Probably because my Japanese composition is really bad. But you can have a story on Shousetsu, and you can have an incredibly influential, you can have an incredibly interesting, intricate, articulate story. One of the examples might be, for instance, like Izumi Jun. Izumi Jun is an isekai author that nobody probably talks about. But I've had a number of authors mention Izumi Jun, including Kanikiro Kogitsune, who mentions Jun as probably one of his most one of the authors he was influenced the most by. But you know what? We don't know about this person, and the reason why is because they didn't write their stories in a way that Shousetsu benefited from. You know, so like we can think of it like this way, right? You know, we can think of it as like the small YouTube channel that did play an influential role. And, you know, a lot of other larger channels may have picked up a few things from them, but we don't know about them, you know, either because they don't do content anymore or they're just so small enough that like they never catch the radar and so on and so forth. And so in this context, right, you might look at something like Isekai and then sort of like have this sort of like pure notion of like the text about it, right? By thinking like, oh my God, the story is so stupid. It's all been done before and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? It survived and got to the top because it listened to these reviews that this anonymous audience was telling it to do. So like it's sort of like thinking about it in this context, right? you look at YouTube videos, the big YouTube videos, the ones that are like crawling to the top of it, and one, we can rightfully criticize them for what we think is really bad content, right? You know, we can say like, oh, you know, this content sucks because this, and this. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to approach this. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that they're working in an ecosystem that really encourages that kind of content.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, in this sense, we can think of isekai like that because we think there's a sort of purity to it, right? Because we're not looking at these stories like they're YouTube videos that exist on a social media platform, which Sosetsu is. We're thinking of them like they're self-contained stories that just blossomed out of the author's head, completely fully formed, like Athena bursting out of Zeus's migraine,
Yeah.
We think of them, they're like that, but in reality, they're more like YouTube videos. They've had to deal with a lot of these other challenges associated, and they've had to adapt in a lot of different ways. And we don't have to like the way that they end up coming out, but there are reasons why they're like the way they are. And to sort of circle in at the point, really sorry it's taking so long.
No, go. It's fine.
But we would not know this if we didn't actually bother to do the research.
Exactly. And it's
if we didn't know about something like Shosetsu, we would literally just be all like, man, why do all isekai suck? They fucking suck.
Oh, why do all these isekai have the same fucking thing in them? They got it's all the same goddamn shit all the time. It's like, well, maybe that's because that's what the fucking trends are on the fucking place it comes from.
Yeah, that's what the platform wants.
Yeah, it's called the meta for a reason, guys.
God damn
the
it.
meta.
But I agree. I agree with you. And
Meta-narrative.
it's here's the thing, because you're going, oh, if I'm rambling on, so it's like I find those rambles actually fucking interesting, right? Because it's shit that I don't know that gives me a broader understanding of what I enjoy. Because I fucking enjoy this medium, right? And it's fun to know more about it and kind of get like what's going on. But these people don't do it, and it's like, it makes me angry. But
it's because they're closed-minded and they don't want to learn more. Like they're more better at being in their own like isolated bubble, instead of like talking to people and learning more about shit, or interacting with others and learning different points of view. Like fuck all that shit. Let's just hang up in our own little bubble because who cares?
let's just what look. Anime's in a vacuum. Source material doesn't exist, right, Joe? It doesn't exist. Books. What are those things? It's outdated
Manga?
trash.
Manga?
Just throw it in the
There's
trash.
things that nobody reads.
What would you say to manga? What do we say to manga?
It's just books. Just books.
Nah.
Read.
No.
We don't.
Fuck you, I don't read.